In the annals of Western legend, few names struck more fear into the hearts of gunslingers than Thomas Dead-Eye Duncan, a man whose deadly accuracy with a Colt revolver seemed almost supernatural. But perhaps even more remarkable than his skill was the secret he carried, a silence that went beyond choice. Some said it was Providence's cruel joke that the West's deadliest duelist never heard the sound of his own gunshots. The thunder of his legend rolling across the frontier like a storm he could only see but never hear. By 1875, most believed Dead-Eye Duncan had vanished into myth, another ghost story told around campfires and whispered in saloons. Few connected him to the quiet farmer who appeared in Shadow Creek Valley, Montana Territory that spring, a solitary figure who communicated through gestures and written words, who worked his land with careful precision and kept mostly to himself. Thomas Carter, as he called himself now, had chosen the valley for its isolation, a place where a man's past could be buried as deep as winter snow. Join me today as we delve into the extraordinary tale of a man who proved that in the West's most dangerous moments, it wasn't the sound of gunfire that mattered, but the steady hand and unflinching eye behind it. If this story speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's tale will shake you to your core. Sheriff Michael Hayes of Shadow Creek had seen his share of peculiar folk drift through his territory, but something about the deaf farmer caught his attention from the first day. There's two kinds of men who choose silence, he'd later write in his journal. Those born to it, and those running from something loud enough to make them seek it out. Carter struck me as both. The farmer had appeared with the spring thaw, leading a wagon loaded with farming equipment and a few personal belongings. His purchase of the old Anderson homestead raised eyebrows. 300 acres of challenging land that had broken stronger men before him. But it was the way he carried himself that truly set him apart. Despite his apparent disability, Carter moved with an awareness that seemed almost uncanny, as if he could sense movement around him better than those with perfect hearing. Doc Sarah. Wheeler was among the first to interact with him extensively, treating a gash on his hand from a barn-raising accident. She couldn't help but notice the calluses on his palms, not just a farmer's thick skin, but the distinctive marks of someone intimately familiar with gun steel. More telling were the scars that spoke of a violent past, a healed bullet wound in his shoulder, knife marks along his ribs, the kind of history that didn't belong on a simple homesteader. His hands told two stories, she would later confide to her diary, the recent past of honest labor and a deeper history written in gunpowder and blood. But it was his eyes that truly gave me pause. They missed nothing, watched everything, the kind of vigilance that comes from living too long in death's shadow. The town's reaction to their unusual new neighbor ranged from curiosity to suspicion. Molly Sullivan, who ran the general store, quickly learned to have paper and pencil ready for his visits. She noticed he always positioned himself with his back to a wall, his eyes casually scanning the room, even as he wrote out his supply orders in an educated hand. Young Deputy James Cooper, eager to prove himself worthy of his badge, took to studying the newcomer from a distance. "Never seen a deaf man so aware," he told Sheriff Hayes one afternoon. "It's like he's got eyes in the back of his head." Yesterday, Frank Miller's boy tried to sneak up behind him with a stick, playing some fool prank. Carter spun around before the kid got within 10 feet, moved so smooth it was almost like someone used to watching for trouble. What none of them knew was that trouble was already riding towards Shadow Creek Valley, in the form of the notorious Keller Gang. Led by the ruthless Marcus Keller, they had carved a bloody trail across 3 territories, leaving empty banks and fresh graves in their wake. They'd been picking their targets carefully, looking for quiet towns off the main rail lines, places where law was thin and resistance unlikely. But fate has a way of turning the tables, and as autumn's first chill touched the Montana air, the Kellers were about to learn that sometimes the deadliest predator is the one you never hear coming. Shadow Creek Valley had known its share of hard men and dark deeds in the years following the Civil War, but the arrival of Jack Turner that October morning seemed to cast a different kind of shadow. He rode in alone, leading a pack mule loaded with mining equipment, his threadbare coat and trail-worn appearance masking a calculated purpose. Those who witnessed his arrival would later recall how his eyes lingered too long on the bank's front window, how his questions about the town seemed just a little too specific. Before we dive deeper into the darkness that was about to descend on Shadow Creek, tell us where you're watching from, and if you're ready for a tale that'll keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure that subscribe button gets hit, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. Thomas Carter was working his south field when Turner first rode past his property. Despite his deafness, years of survival had taught him to feel the vibrations of approaching horses through the earth itself. He straightened from his work, one hand casually resting near the worn handle of his farming knife, and watched the stranger pass with the kind of careful attention that spoke of old habits and hard-learned lessons. That evening, Doc Sarah Wheeler decided to pay Carter a visit, ostensibly to check on his healed hand, but truly driven by an instinct she'd learned to trust. She found him on his porch, whittling what appeared to be a new handle for his plow. Their conversation, conducted through written notes in the fading light, seemed ordinary enough until she mentioned the newcomer in town. Carter's pencil paused briefly over the paper before writing, "Describe his guns." The question struck her as odd. Not what he carried, but specifically his guns. When she mentioned the custom-gripped Remington-worn cross-draw style, something flickered in Carter's eyes, a recognition he quickly masked. "Jack Turner died at Dead Man's Gulch 2 years ago," he wrote, then quickly crumpled the paper, his expression suggesting he'd revealed more than he intended. Before she could question him further, he turned the conversation to safer topics: crop yields and coming weather. In town, Sheriff Hayes was conducting his own investigation into their visitor. A telegram to the Territorial Marshal's office had brought a troubling response. 3 banks hit in the past month, each preceded by the arrival of a lone prospector, asking innocent questions. The Keller gang's signature was becoming clear, but it was the description of one particular member that caught Hayes's attention. "Marcus Keller's scout," Deputy Cooper explained, reading the telegram for the 3rd time. "Always comes alone first, poses as a miner down on his luck. By the time folks realize what's happening, the whole gang's in town, and it's too late." The gang's reputation was well-earned. Led by Marcus Keller, a former Union cavalry officer turned outlaw, they operated with military precision. Each robbery was carefully planned, executed with a ruthlessness that left no witnesses to spread warnings to other towns. But it was Keller's brother Samuel who truly terrified people, a psychopath who delighted in making examples of anyone who resisted. That night, as autumn wind moaned through Shadow Creek Valley, Turner sat in his room at the boarding house, writing a detailed letter about the town's defenses, its routines and its weaknesses. His pen paused over a description of the deaf farmer, something about the man's bearing nagging at his memory. He'd seen gun handlers, fighters, and killers across 3 territories, and despite Carter's simple clothes and calloused farmers' hands, something about him radiated the kind of quiet lethality that set off warning signals in Turner's trail-hardened instincts. But Turner had his own reputation to consider. He'd spent the past 5 years as Marcus Keller's eyes and ears, surveying targets and planning operations that had never failed. One suspicious farmer, deaf at that, wasn't going to derail their biggest score yet. Still, as he sealed the letter, destined for a remote drop point, Turner couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow Creek Valley might be hiding secrets far deadlier than his own. What he couldn't know was that at that very moment, Thomas Carter sat at his kitchen table, a hidden, compartment in his trunk open before him. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a custom Colt revolver, its pearl grips worn smooth by years of use. The weapon that had made Dead-Eye Duncan a legend was about to be awakened from its long slumber, and the silence of Shadow Creek Valley would soon be broken by the sound of old debts being settled. The letter Jack Turner had written made its way through 3 pairs of hands before reaching Marcus Keller's camp in the remote Montana wilderness. The outlaw leader sat by his campfire, the flames casting shifting shadows across his weather-worn face, as he read the details of Shadow Creek Valley's vulnerabilities. 20 men gathered around him, hardened killers drawn to his leadership by the promise of wealth and the protection of his military precision. Samuel Keller, sprawled on a fallen log and cleaning his knife, watched his brother's expression change as he read. "Something wrong?" he asked, noting the slight frown that crossed Marcus's face. The older Keller brother folded the letter carefully, his movements deliberate as always. Turner's usually more decisive in his recommendations. Something's got him spooked. The gang's reputation had been built on Turner's meticulous scouting. His reports were typically confident assessments of a target's weaknesses, but this letter carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. "Says there's something about one of the farmers," Marcus mused. "A deaf man working the old Anderson place. Turner can't put his finger on it, but something about him feels wrong." Samuel laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the forest quiet. "A deaf farmer? That's what's got our mighty scout worried?" He tested his knife's edge against his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood. "Hell, that just makes things easier. Won't even hear us coming." But Marcus Keller hadn't survived this long by ignoring his instincts, or Turner's. "Turner's hunches have kept us alive more than once," he reminded his brother. "If something's got him nervous, we need to know why." He turned to one of his men, a former cavalry scout named Webb. "Ride to Shadow Creek. Watch this farmer, but keep your distance. I want to know everything about him before we move." Back in Shadow Creek Valley, Thomas Carter's daily routine continued unchanged, but there was a new alertness to his movements. Doc Sarah Wheeler, making her regular rounds, noticed he'd taken to carrying his farming knife in a different position, more accessible, more like a weapon than a tool. She also caught him watching the horizon more frequently, his eyes scanning the ridgelines with practiced precision. During one of her visits, she found him repairing his fence line, the work bringing him closer to town than usual. Their written conversation seemed casual enough until he asked an oddly specific question about Turner's movements. "A man who can't hear learns to see what others miss," he wrote, then added, "Sometimes silence shows you things noise hides." Sheriff Hayes, meanwhile, had his own concerns growing. 3 more strangers had drifted into town over the past week, each carrying the hard look of men acquainted with violence. They played their roles well: a cattle buyer, a gambler, and a drifting ranch hand. But Hayes had been lawman long enough to recognize scouts establishing a perimeter. "They're building something," he confided to Deputy Cooper one evening, "like a noose slowly tightening around our neck." The young deputies and unconsciously drifted to his gun. "Maybe we should send for help from the Territorial Marshal's office." Hayes shook his head slowly. By the time help arrived, whatever's coming would already be here. One person who'd noticed these changes more than most was Molly Sullivan. From her general store's vantage point, she watched the subtle shift in the town's atmosphere. Carter's visits had become more frequent, each time positioning himself to observe the strangers while pretending to study her goods. During one visit, he'd written a peculiar question: "Your storeroom, does it have a back exit?" That night, as Shadow Creek Valley settled into an uneasy sleep, Webb watched Carter's farm from a hidden position in the hills. What he saw both confused and unsettled him. The deaf farmer moved around his property with systematic thoroughness, checking sightlines, noting approaches, almost as if Webb's eyes widened with sudden recognition. The man was setting up defensive positions, preparing for a fight with the tactical precision of someone who'd done it before. In his camp, Marcus Keller was about to receive news that would change everything. A telegraph from a contact in the marshal's office carrying a vital piece of information about Shadow Creek Valley's mysterious deaf farmer. But by then, the wheels of fate were already turning, and the valley was about to become a proving ground where old legends and new ambitions would collide in a dance of death and silence. The telegram that reached Marcus Keller's camp in the pre-dawn hours carried words that sent a chill through even his battle-hardened nerves. Deaf farmer matches description of Dead-Eye Duncan. Stop. Disappeared after Willow Creek massacre. 3 years ago. Stop. Known for killing Jacob Keller, your cousin. Stop. Extreme caution advised. Stop. The paper trembled slightly in Marcus's weathered hands as memories of his cousin's death surfaced. Before we dive deeper into this revelation, remember to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the story of how Dead-Eye Duncan earned his legendary status is coming tomorrow, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Samuel Keller's reaction to the news was explosive. "Duncan," he snarled, pacing like a caged wolf, "the man who gunned down Jacob in cold blood is hiding in that valley?" Marcus watched his brother's rage build, knowing how close Samuel and Jacob had been. The younger Keller had never forgiven Duncan for killing their cousin in that famous duel at Willow Creek. Even though Jacob had called Duncan out himself, Webb's report, delivered shortly after the telegram, only confirmed their suspicions. "He's got the place set up like a fortress," the scout explained. "Every approach covered, clear lines of fire. Man deaf as a post shouldn't know military tactics like that." He hesitated before adding, "And there's something else. Found an old wanted poster in the sheriff's office. The sketch of Duncan could be Carter. Just add a few years and some grey." In Shadow Creek, the morning brought its own revelations. Doc Sarah Wheeler, treating a minor injury at Carter's farm, noticed something she'd overlooked before. When a door slammed unexpectedly in the wind, Carter's hand had moved to his right hip, not the natural reaction of a farmer, but the instinct of a gunfighter reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. Their written conversation that morning took an unexpected turn when she mentioned the name Dead-Eye Duncan in passing. Carter's pencil froze mid-word, a momentary hesitation that spoke volumes. His next written words were careful, measured. "That name belongs to a dead man." But Sarah had been a frontier doctor long enough to recognize when someone was speaking about themselves in the third person. Back in town, Sheriff Hayes was piecing together his own puzzle. His old friend, Marshal Davidson, had written back about Dead-Eye Duncan's legendary status. "Never seen anything like him," the letter read. "Could hit a target at 50 paces with his eyes closed. Seemed to feel where his shots would land. Some say losing his hearing young made his other senses sharper. Others claim it was a gift from God or the devil himself. All I know is 27 men called him out. 27 men died." The marshal's letter went on to describe Duncan's last known appearance. After Willow Creek, something changed. The violence had finally taken its toll. He hung up his guns, or so the story goes. But Hayes, if your farmer is him, watch your back. A man like that doesn't lose his instincts, just his desire to use them. Turner, still playing his role as the prospector, watched these developments with growing unease. He'd seen his share of gunmen, but Duncan was different. Stories still circulated about how he'd once faced down 3 brothers in Dodge City, dropping all of them before their hands could clear leather. The fact that he couldn't hear the shots only added to his mystique. It was said he could read a man's intentions in the tensing of their muscles, the flicker of their eyes. As evening approached, Carter sat at his kitchen table, writing in a journal he kept locked in that hidden compartment with his gun. "The past never stays buried," he wrote. Sometimes it claws its way back to the surface like a restless corpse. I came here seeking peace, thinking I could leave Dead-Eye Duncan behind. But now Keller's men are circling, and I can feel that old familiar tension building, the same tension that preceded every duel, every killing. The difference is, this time I didn't go looking for trouble. This time trouble found me. The sun set over Shadow Creek Valley, painting the sky in shades of blood red. In his camp, Marcus Keller was formulating a new plan. The discovery of Duncan's identity changed everything. This would no longer be a simple robbery. This would be revenge, served cold and calculated. But as he plotted, he failed to consider one crucial detail. Dead-Eye Duncan had never lost a duel, and the silence that had made him legend was about to become his greatest weapon once again. Marcus Keller believed in careful planning, but his brother Samuel had other ideas. As the autumn moon cast long shadows across their camp, Samuel was already mounting up, gun belts strapped low and tight. "I'm paying our deaf friend a visit," he announced, eyes glinting with malevolent purpose. "Time to see if the legend bleeds." Before we continue with Samuel's fateful decision, if you're enjoying this tale of revenge and redemption, make sure you're subscribed. Tomorrow's story about the infamous Willow Creek Massacre will shed new light on everything you're about to witness. Marcus caught his brother's reins, his face tight with controlled anger. "You're going to ruin everything, just like always." But Samuel just laughed, that same unhinged sound that had preceded so many previous acts of violence. "Jacob was like a brother to me, Marcus, more than you ever were. Duncan needs to answer." For that, in Shadow Creek Valley, Thomas Carter was acutely aware of the changing atmosphere. Though he couldn't hear the night sounds, years of survival had taught him to read other signs. His horses were restless, shifting in their stalls. The autumn wind carried hints of tobacco smoke from the ridgeline where Webb maintained his watch. Most telling was the way shadows moved against the tree line, too purposeful to be natural, too careful to be innocent. Doc Sarah Wheeler, returning late from a difficult berth at the Peterson farm, noticed the signs as well. Riders on the outskirts of town moving with military precision. She'd served as a nurse during the war, treated enough soldiers to recognize the disciplined movements of men preparing for combat. Her concern for Carter, for Duncan, she corrected herself mentally, led her to take a detour past his farm. She found him on his porch, a cup of coffee cooling beside him, his eyes never leaving the darkness beyond his property line. Their conversation that evening, conducted by lamplight and written words, revealed new layers to the man she'd come to respect. "Why did you really come here?" she wrote, her pencil hesitating before adding, "Dead-Eye Duncan?" His response was slow, deliberate. "Every man has three choices in life: run from the past, embrace it, or find a way to live with it. I chose the third path. This land, this work, it gives me peace. Or did, until now." The Willow Creek story, she wrote, was Jacob Keller really the one who... Carter's hand covered the paper before she could finish. His next words were carefully chosen. "Some stories are better left in the grave with the dead, but since you ask, Jacob Keller killed a boy, 16 years old, shot him in the back over a card game. When I called him out for it, he drew first. The fact that he died for it wasn't my choice, it was his." In town, Sheriff Hayes and Deputy Cooper were preparing for the storm they could feel brewing. Hayes had distributed extra ammunition to trusted townspeople, positioned lookouts, and sent urgent telegrams to neighboring settlements. But he knew help would arrive too late, if it came at all. "You really think he's him?" Cooper asked, checking his revolver for the 100th time. "Dead-Eye Duncan?" Hayes nodded slowly. "Saw him once, years ago in Kansas. Man killed 3 outlaws without seeming to aim, like he could feel where his bullets needed to go. Never saw anything like it before or since." Samuel Keller, meanwhile, had reached the valley's edge, 4 of his most vicious men riding with him against Marcus's explicit orders. The moon illuminated Carter's farmhouse below, smoke rising peacefully from its chimney. Samuel's face twisted into a cruel smile as he checked his guns. "Tonight," he whispered, "we find out if the ghost of Dead-Eye Duncan can still draw as fast as the legends say." But what Samuel didn't realize was that Thomas Carter had already sensed their approach. Though he couldn't hear them coming, a lifetime of hyper-awareness had taught him to read countless other signs. The way his horses turned their heads, the subtle vibrations through the floorboards, the shift in air pressure as riders descended. Into the valley, inside his house, the hidden compartment lay open. The legendary Colt revolver rested in his hands, its familiar weight stirring memories he'd spent years trying to bury. As he loaded it with the same methodical precision that had made him a legend, Carter wrote one final entry in his journal. "Some men choose the path of violence. I simply became the consequence of their choice. Tonight, it seems, old debts must be paid in full." Samuel Keller's approach to Carter's farm displayed none of his brother's tactical precision. Rage and whiskey had stripped away any pretense of stealth as he and his 4 men thundered down the moonlit slope. The autumn wind carried the sound of their approach across the valley, a warning to everyone except the man they were hunting. If you're just joining us on this journey into one of the West's most extraordinary confrontations, take a moment to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode about Dead-Eye Duncan's legendary Kansas shootout will leave you breathless. In town, Sheriff Hayes heard the riders and quickly assembled a small posse. "Not that Carter needs the help," he muttered to Deputy Cooper as they mounted up. "If he's who we think he is, those men are riding to their own funeral." Doc Sarah Wheeler, still at Carter's farm, watched him transform before her eyes. The careful movements of the farmer gave way to something else entirely, an economy of motion that spoke of countless gunfights. He gestured for her to take cover in the root cellar, his expression brooking no argument. Before descending into the cellar, she grabbed his arm and pressed a folded paper into his hand. By lamplight, he read her hurried words. "They say Dead-Eye Duncan could sense a man's intention to draw before they moved." Was it true? His response was simple. Never needed to hear the draw. Could read it in their eyes. Fear has a way of showing itself before the hand moves. Samuel Keller and his men reined up 50 yards from the house, spreading out in a manner that might have been tactical if they'd been sober. "Duncan!" Samuel bellowed into the night. "Get out here and face me! Time!" "To answer for Jacob." Carter stood in his doorway, silhouetted by the lamplight behind him. To the casual observer, he appeared unarmed, his hands empty at his sides. But Sarah, watching through a crack in the cellar doors, noticed how his right hand hung slightly, away from his body, inches from where a gun belt would normally ride. "Look at him, boys!" Samuel laughed, the sound echoing across the yard. "The great Dead-Eye Duncan playing farmer. What's wrong? Lost your taste for iron?" He drew his revolver with theatrical slowness, pointing it at the silent figure in the doorway. "Maybe you need some motivation. Should I burn the house down? Or maybe start with the barn?" One of Samuel's men, more observant or perhaps more sober than his boss, noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. Carter's eyes seemed to glow in the lamplight, moving from man to man with mechanical precision, logging positions, reading stances. The outlaw had seen gun handlers before, but this was different. This was like watching a wolf assess its prey. "Samuel," the man started to warn, but it was too late. Keller's patience had run out. "Draw, you deaf bastard!" Samuel roared, his gun rising to fire. What happened next would be debated in saloons across the territory for years to come. Carter's right hand moved with such speed it seemed to disappear. The Colt materialized as if conjured from thin air. 3 shots rang out in such rapid succession they sounded like a single rolling thunderclap. Samuel's first shot went wild, passing through the space Carter had occupied a split second before. But Carter's shots found their marks with supernatural accuracy. Two of Keller's men pitched backward from their saddles, their guns not even cleared from their holsters. The third shot knocked Samuel's revolver from his hand with surgical precision, taking 2 fingers with it. The remaining outlaws, suddenly sober and terrified, wheeled their horses to flee. Carter's gun tracked their movement, but didn't fire. He'd meant those shots as a message, not a slaughter. Samuel Keller clutched his maimed hand to his chest, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. "How?" he gasped. "You couldn't even hear us." "Coming!" Carter walked slowly down his porch steps, the legendary Colt held easily at his side. Doc Wheeler emerged from the cellar with her medical bag, already moving to tend the wounded. The deaf gunslinger produced a small slate and wrote a message, holding it up for Samuel to read. "Next time, bring your brother. This conversation isn't finished." In the distance, Sheriff Hayes and his posse were approaching at a gallop, drawn by the gunfire, but they'd arrived to find only the aftermath. 3 men down, a legend reborn, and the opening shots of a conflict that was far from over. The ghost of Dead-Eye Duncan had shown his face at last, and Shadow Creek Valley would never be the same. Dawn broke over Shadow Creek Valley, painting the aftermath of the night's violence in harsh clarity. Doc Sarah Wheeler had worked through the darkness, treating Samuel Keller's mangled hand and the 2 surviving members of his ill-fated raid. The dead were laid out in Carter's barn, covered with rough blankets, a stark reminder that legends often exact a bloody price. If you're finding yourself drawn into this tale of justice and vengeance, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we'll delve into the full story of how Dead-Eye Duncan first lost his hearing and why it made him even deadlier. Sheriff Hayes stood in Carter's yard, studying the pattern of shell casings in the dirt. 3 shots, he mused to Deputy Cooper, all placed perfect in the dark against moving targets. He shook his head in wonder. Stories didn't do him justice. Inside the house, Thomas Carter sat at his kitchen table, the infamous Colt revolver resting before him like a sleeping snake. His conversation with Doc Wheeler, conducted through written words, revealed layers of history he'd kept buried for years. "The deafness," she wrote, "was it from birth?" Carter's pencil moved slowly, deliberately. "Scarlet fever, age 12. By 15, I could shoot better than men twice my age. When you can't hear the world, you learn to see it differently. Every movement tells a story. Every gesture holds meaning. In town, news of the shootout spread like wildfire. Molly Sullivan's store became a hub of speculation and storytelling as witnesses shared their accounts. Moved like lightning, young Tommy Peters insisted. He'd watched from his family's farm 1/2 mile away. Never seen anything like it. Like something out of them dime novels. But while the town buzzed with excitement, darker currents were moving beneath the surface. Jack Turner, watching from the shadows of the saloon, knew Marcus Keller's reaction to his brother's humiliation would be swift and terrible. He'd seen the gang leader's capacity for calculated violence firsthand. Turner's fears proved well-founded. By mid-morning, a rider arrived at Marcus Keller's camp with news of Samuel's defeat. The gang leader's reaction was characteristic. No explosion of rage, just a cold, tactical fury that sent chills through his hardened men. "Samuel always was a fool," Marcus told his assembled gang. 25 stone-cold killers hanging on his every word. "But he's given us something valuable, confirmation. Now we know exactly what we're dealing with." He unfolded a weathered, wanted poster showing a younger version of Dead-Eye Duncan. "This man's built his legend on one simple fact. He's never lost a one-on-one fight, so we won't give him one." Back at the farm, Carter was making preparations of his own. Sheriff Hayes found him methodically checking sight lines and angles from every window. Their written exchange was brief but revealing. "Marcus won't come alone," Hayes wrote. Carter's response was simple. He never did understand. The silence isn't a weakness, it's a weapon. Doc Wheeler, finishing her treatment of Samuel's hand, caught fragments of the wounded man's feverish mumblings. He spoke of Jacob Keller, of the real reason behind the blood feud that had led to this moment. The truth, she realized, was far more complex than the simple story of a card game gone wrong. By afternoon, Samuel and his wounded men had been moved to the town jail for safekeeping. Deputy Cooper, standing guard, noticed how Samuel flinched at every movement, his eyes holding the haunted look of a man who'd seen something beyond his understanding. "You don't know what's coming," Samuel told Cooper during a lucid moment. "Marcus won't just kill Duncan. He'll destroy everything and everyone around him. That's how he works. Total war." As evening approached, Carter made one final entry in his journal, his words revealing both resolution and regret. "I thought I could leave the violence behind, find peace in honest work. But some debts can only be paid in lead and blood. Marcus Keller is coming, bringing an army to face a ghost. He never understood that in the darkness, in the silence, numbers mean nothing. The quiet men are always the deadliest." The sun set. Over Shadow Creek Valley, shadows lengthening like fingers, reaching for the coming violence. In his camp, Marcus Keller finalized his plans for an assault that would become legendary, but he was preparing to fight a gunfighter when what waited in the valley was something far more dangerous, a hunter who had made silence his greatest ally. Marcus Keller's preparation for war was methodical, precise, every bit the military commander he'd been during the conflict between North and South. His men watched with a mixture of awe and fear as he transformed their camp into a staging ground for what would become one of the most notorious assaults in Western history. Before we continue with this tale of calculated vengeance, take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. Tomorrow's episode reveals the shocking truth about the Keller family's dark past. And believe me, it changes everything. Duncan's turned that farm into a fortress, Webb reported, having just returned from another scouting mission. Man's got firing positions covering every approach, even rigged some kind of system with strings and bells, probably to warn him of movement since he can't hear. Marcus studied the crude map they'd drawn of Carter's property. "He's expecting a frontal assault," he mused, "just like Samuel gave him. But we're going to show him why I was a colonel, while my brother barely made sergeant." His finger traced a route through the valley. "We'll give him what he expects, and then something he doesn't." In town, Doc Sarah Wheeler was piecing together a darker story from Samuel's fever-induced confessions. The tale of Jacob Keller's death was more complex than anyone knew. She brought her discoveries to Sheriff Hayes in his office, away from prying ears. "It wasn't just about a card game," she explained, showing him her notes. "Jacob Keller was running a protection racket in Willow Creek. The boy he killed, the one that made Duncan call him out, was trying to protect his sister from Jacob's advances." Hayes absorbed this information with a grim expression. And Marcus? According to Samuel, Marcus knew everything. He was the one who taught Jacob how to intimidate people, how to make examples of those who resisted. The whole Keller family built their fortune on fear. At his farm, Carter was writing in his journal when Doc Wheeler arrived with this new information. Their written conversation revealed even more layers to the old tragedy. "I knew about Marcus's involvement," Carter wrote. "That's why I didn't stop with Jacob. Was working my way up the family tree when they burned Willow Creek. 18 innocent people died in that fire. Their way of sending a message." "Is that why you disappeared?" she asked on paper. His response was heavy with unspoken pain. "Realized I'd become what I was fighting. Needed to find another way. Thought I had, until now." Meanwhile, Jack Turner was playing his own dangerous game. His evening report to Marcus contained carefully crafted misinformation about the town's defenses. He'd seen enough death in his years with the gang. Something about Duncan's silent dignity, his attempt to build an honest life, had stirred long-buried remnants of Turner's conscience. But Marcus Keller was nobody's fool. He'd noticed the subtle hesitation in Turner's reports, the slight inconsistencies. "Send 4 men into town," he ordered Webb after Turner left. "Watch him. If he tries to warn Duncan or the sheriff—" He left the sentence unfinished, but Webb understood. As night fell, Deputy Cooper made a disturbing discovery during his patrol. Fresh tracks leading into the hills. Not just horses, but wagon wheels. "They're bringing in heavy weapons," he reported to Hayes. "The kind of artillery they used in the war." This news brought a grim smile to Hayes's face. Marcus always did think bigger than his brother. Better warn Carter they're planning something spectacular. But when they arrived at the farm, they found Carter had company. 3 faces from his past had appeared as if summoned by the coming storm. Other legendary gunfighters who owed their lives to Dead-Eye Duncan from various encounters over the years. "Word travels," wrote John Swift Hand McGrath, whose speed with a gun was second only to Duncan's. "Figured you might want some backup this time." Carter's response revealed both gratitude and concern. "This isn't your fight." The third visitor, a Cherokee shooter known only as Hawk, wrote, "You made it our fight when you saved each of us. Besides, Marcus Keller's evil touches all territories. Time it ended." The night deepened over Shadow Creek Valley as both sides strengthened their positions. Marcus Keller had his army and his artillery, but he'd made a crucial mistake. He thought he was just facing Dead-Eye Duncan, the legendary duelist. What awaited him was something far more dangerous, a man who had mastered the art of silent warfare, now backed by equally legendary allies who understood that some debts can only be repaid in blood and loyalty. The arrival of Duncan's legendary allies transformed the atmosphere in Shadow Creek Valley. John McGrath worked with methodical precision, setting up hidden firing positions throughout the property, while Hawk's Cherokee tracking skills helped identify and fortify likely assault routes. The third man, a silver-haired veteran known as Judge Harrison, brought decades of tactical experience from his days as a territorial marshal. If you're invested in this tale of loyalty and revenge, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's episode about the formation of these legendary partnerships will leave you speechless. Marcus Keller, receiving reports of the new arrivals, called his lieutenants together. 3 more guns won't change anything," he assured them, though his tight expression suggested otherwise. "But we'll accelerate our timeline. Tonight, we show them why the Keller name is feared across the territories." In town, Jack Turner was reaching a decision of his own. Years of serving as Keller's scout had shown him the depths of the man's cruelty, and something about Duncan's quiet dignity had stirred his conscience. He made his way to the sheriff's office, knowing his next actions would either be his redemption or his death sentence. "Marcus has more than guns planned," Turner revealed to Hayes and Cooper. "He's bringing in canisters of Greek fire, stuff that burns even on water. Means to burn the whole valley if he has to." He spread out a rough map, marking positions. Main force will hit from the north, but he's got 3 other groups moving through these draws here, all coordinated with signal flares. At the farm, Duncan sat with his old allies, their conversation flowing through written notes and hand signals developed during their shared past. Judge Harrison's slate carried a warning. Marcus was more than a colonel in the war. He ran special operations, terror tactics. Man's got a genius for turning strength into weakness. Duncan's response was typically succinct. "Can't turn silence against me. Already made it my weapon." Doc Sarah Wheeler, arriving to check on Samuel's hand, brought more revelations. "Found this in his saddlebags," she wrote, showing Duncan a weathered journal. "It's Jacob Keller's diary, what really happened in Willow Creek. It wasn't just about that boy you avenged." The pages told a darker story. Jacob had been experimenting with new methods of intimidation, burning out homesteaders who refused to pay protection money. Marcus hadn't just approved, he'd been using Willow Creek as a testing ground for techniques he'd developed during the war. The boy's death had simply been the spark that brought Duncan into their world. Swift-hand McGrath, reading over Duncan's shoulder, wrote with barely controlled rage, "They burned those families to study how terror spreads through a community, like it was some kind of science." Hawk, who'd been watching the surrounding hills, suddenly signaled for attention. Moving with the silence of his Cherokee training, he led them to the barn. Through gaps in the walls, they could see multiple signal fires being lit on the ridgelines, Keller's forces moving into position. In town, Deputy Cooper noticed another detail. Strangers were quietly positioning themselves around key buildings. "Not just here for the bank anymore," he told Hayes. "They're setting up to control the whole town." Turner, proving his change of heart, added crucial intelligence. "Marcus means to take the town first, use the people as leverage. Knows Duncan's got a conscience, even if he pretends otherwise." As dusk approached, the tension in Shadow Creek Valley reached a breaking point. Judge Harrison, studying the positions of the signal fires, wrote what everyone was thinking. "This isn't just an assault. It's a siege. He means to trap us, then burn everything down around us." Duncan stood on his porch, watching the sun set behind gathering storm clouds. Though he couldn't hear the thunder rumbling in the distance, he could feel its vibrations through the wooden boards beneath his feet. His journal's final entry for the day was brief but resolute. "Marcus thinks he's hunting a ghost, using my silence against me. But he forgot the first rule of hunting. Sometimes the prey becomes the predator." Inside the house, his allies made final preparations. McGrath checked weapons while Hawk laid out hunting knives and Judge Harrison studied maps. Outside, the storm clouds thickened, promising a night where visibility would be as limited as Duncan's hearing, a darkness where his lifetime of adapting to silence might make the difference between victory and annihilation. The storm broke over Shadow Creek Valley with biblical fury, turning dusk into premature night. Lightning transformed the landscape into stuttering snapshots of movement as Marcus Keller's forces began their advance. The rain, driving in sheets, masked the sound of their approach, an advantage they thought they held over the deaf gunslinger waiting in the darkness. Before we dive into this pivotal battle, make sure you're subscribed for tomorrow's incredible story about another legendary nighttime siege where Dead-Eye Duncan's silence proved deadlier than any bullet. The first sign that Marcus had underestimated his opponent came when his eastern flanking group triggered a series of carefully placed tripwires. Bells that Duncan couldn't hear sent livestock stampeding through their ranks, disrupting their careful formation. In the chaos, 2 men went down with precisely placed shots from Swift-hand McGrath's position in the barn loft. "He's turned the whole damn valley into a trap," Webb realized, watching through his field glasses as the attack faltered. Marcus, observing from his command position, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Duncan hadn't just prepared for an attack. He'd orchestrated the battlefield like a conductor, arranging a symphony of violence. In town, Keller's men found themselves facing unexpected resistance. Sheriff Hayes and Deputy Cooper had distributed weapons to trusted townspeople, turning every shadow into a potential threat. Jack Turner, proving his redemption, helped coordinate the defense, his intimate knowledge of Keller's tactics proving invaluable. "They'll try to fire the livery stable next," Turner warned. "Create panic, drive people into the streets." But Hayes had already prepared for this, positioning water barrels and organizing bucket brigades. The town's resistance was buying precious time for what was happening at Duncan's farm. Through the storm's fury, Judge Harrison coordinated the defense with hand signals and prearranged light patterns. Hawk's Cherokee hunting skills proved lethal. 3 more of Keller's men simply vanished into the darkness, their screams lost in the thunder. Marcus, realizing his initial thrust had failed, shifted to his secondary strategy. "Bring up the artillery," he ordered. "Let's see how good Duncan's aim is when the whole valley's on fire." The Greek fire canisters were wheeled forward, their deadly contents ready to turn the rain-soaked night into an inferno. But Duncan had prepared for this too. The first canister explosion illuminated a devastating truth. The apparent defensive positions they'd observed for days were decoys. The real firing positions had been carefully hidden, and now they opened up with devastating accuracy. Duncan himself seemed to materialize out of the storm like a vengeful spirit, his shots finding targets with supernatural precision despite the darkness and rain. Doc Sarah Wheeler, watching from her clinic window, saw something remarkable in the chaos. Every time lightning flashed, she caught glimpses of Duncan moving through the battle with uncanny awareness. He's using the lightning, she realized. The flashes are giving him perfect snapshots of the battlefield, and in between, he's working purely on instinct and memory. In the midst of the fighting, Samuel Keller escaped from the jail in the confusion, his maimed hand forgotten in his desperate need for revenge. He stumbled through the storm toward his brother's position, shouting warnings that were lost in the tempest. "It's not just Duncan. The whole valley's turned against us." Marcus was beginning to realize the same thing. His careful planning, his superior numbers, all of it was being systematically dismantled by a combination of Duncan's strategic genius and the valley's united resistance. But he had one more card to play, a desperate gambit that would either break the deadlock or destroy everything. "Target the town," he ordered his artillery crews. "If Duncan wants to protect these people, let's see him stop Greek fire with that famous gun of his." The order passed through the rain-soaked night, artillery pieces being repositioned through the mud and chaos. What Marcus couldn't know was that Duncan had anticipated this move. As Keller's men struggled to aim their weapons through the storm, silent figures were already moving through the darkness. Duncan's lifetime of working without sound had taught him that true victory often came not from what you could see or hear, but from what you could sense was coming. The storm raged on, its lightning illuminating a battlefield where silence had become the deadliest weapon of all. The next few minutes would determine not just the fate of Shadow Creek Valley, but whether the legend of Dead-Eye Duncan would end in triumph or tragedy. Marcus Keller's order to target the town revealed the desperation behind his tactical genius. As his men struggled to reposition the artillery through the storm-churned mud, a new element entered the chaos. Hawk, moving like a shadow through the darkness, had recognized the crucial moment to spring Duncan's most elaborate trap. Before we continue with this pivotal moment, make sure you've subscribed, because tomorrow's episode reveals the secret technique that made Dead-Eye Duncan the most feared gunslinger in 3 territories. The Cherokee warrior triggered a series of carefully prepared charges, not to kill, but to reshape the battlefield itself. Controlled avalanches of mud and rock suddenly cut off Keller's artillery positions from his main force. In the lightning-illuminated chaos, Marcus watched his carefully orchestrated assault fragment into isolated pockets of resistance. "He's been herding us," Webb realized, horror dawning in his voice. "Every retreat, every defensive position, he's been leading us exactly where he wanted us." The scout had seen military operations during the war, but this was different. This was a hunter's strategy, turning the prey's strength against itself. In town, Jack Turner led Sheriff Hayes and a group of defenders in a daring move to secure the high ground around the livery stable. Duncan said to watch for the signal, Turner explained, checking his pocket watch in a lightning flash. "Any minute now." As if summoned by his words, an unearthly whistle cut through the storm. Judge Harrison's cavalry whistle, its pitch designed to carry over battlefield chaos. To the untrained ear, it might have sounded like random notes, but to Keller's veterans, it carried a chilling familiarity. "Those are Union cavalry signals," one man shouted. "They're all around us." The psychological impact was devastating. Marcus had trained his men to fear Union cavalry tactics during the war, And now those same signals seemed to echo from every direction, suggesting a force far larger than Duncan's small group of allies. Men began firing at shadows, their shots wild and desperate. Through this manufactured chaos, Duncan moved with lethal purpose. His inability to hear the battlefield noise had become his greatest asset. No confusion, no distraction, just pure focus as he systematically engaged targets illuminated by the lightning. Each flash showed him a frozen tableau of the battle, and in the darkness between he moved with the fluid certainty of a man who had made silence his ally. Samuel Keller, his wounded hand burning with infection and rage, stumbled through the battle toward what he thought was his brother's position. Instead, he found himself face to face with Swift-Hand McGrath. The gunfighter's draw was legendary, second only to Duncan's, but he didn't reach for his weapon. "Your brother abandoned you," McGrath wrote quickly on a rain-soaked notepad, "left you as a sacrifice while he repositions his forces." The truth of these words struck deeper than any bullet. Samuel had always suspected he was the expendable Keller, and now the proof was dying with him in the mud. Doc Sarah Wheeler, coordinating the town's medical response, noticed a pattern in Duncan's movement through her spyglass. "He's not just picking targets of opportunity," she realized. "He's systematically cutting off every escape route, every fallback position. This isn't just a battle, it's a closing trap." Marcus Keller, watching his strategy unravel, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Push through to the house," he ordered his remaining men. "If we can't have the town, we'll burn him out." But even as the words left his mouth, he sensed the fatal flaw in his thinking. The storm, the mud, the confusion, all of it had been part of Duncan's plan. Judge Harrison, observing from his elevated position, scrawled a note to Hawk. "Your people have a word for this kind of fight?" The Cherokee warrior's response was grim. "Yes, we call it ghost walking, when the hunter becomes a spirit that the prey cannot see or hear until it's too late." As midnight approached, the battle for Shadow Creek Valley had transformed from a military operation into something more primal. Duncan wasn't just fighting Keller's forces, he was hunting them, using his lifetime of silence to orchestrate a symphony of destruction that only he could fully comprehend. The storm raged on, and in its fury, the legend of Dead-Eye Duncan was being rewritten, not just as a deadly shot, but as a master strategist who had turned his greatest weakness into an unstoppable strength. Marcus Keller had built his reputation on never losing control of a situation, but as midnight passed in Shadow Creek Valley, he felt his grip on victory slipping away like water through his fingers. The storm's fury had reached its peak, turning the battlefield into a nightmare of mud and shadow, where Duncan's silent warfare reigned supreme. If you're riveted by this clash of titans, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's episode reveals the untold story of Marcus Keller's own dark past that set this confrontation in motion. "Webb!" Marcus shouted through the tempest. "Get the men to—" His words cut off as a bullet passed so close it clipped his collar. In the next lightning flash, he caught a glimpse of Duncan standing in the open, steam rising from his Colt's barrel. The shot had been a message. Even in chaos, the deaf gunslinger could target anything he could see. Swift hand, McGrath and Hawk had systematically eliminated Marcus's lieutenants, leaving his remaining men leaderless and scattered. Judge Harrison's cavalry signals continued to echo through the valley, making Keller's forces believe they were surrounded by a much larger force. The psychological warfare was taking its toll. Hardened gunmen were breaking, fleeing into the storm. Samuel Keller, driven by fever and hatred, made one last attempt to reach his brother. Instead, he found himself face to face with Jack Turner. "Your brother's using you again," Turner said, lowering his gun. "Just like he used Jacob, just like he uses everyone." In town, Sheriff Hayes and Deputy Cooper had successfully repelled the assault on the bank. But Doc Sarah Wheeler brought disturbing news. "They're placing oil barrels around the town perimeter," she reported. "Marcus is preparing to burn everything if he can't have it." The revelation spurred Hayes into action. "Get everyone to the church basement," he ordered Cooper. "If Keller means to turn this into Willow Creek all over again, we'll be ready this time." The memory of that tragedy hung heavy in the rain-soaked air. 18 innocent lives lost to the Keller's cruelty. Duncan, moving through the storm like a vengeful spirit, had been steadily pushing toward Marcus's position. His lifetime of silence had taught him to read intention in the subtlest movements, to sense danger in the way shadows shifted. Now those skills were leading him to his final confrontation with the man who had orchestrated so much suffering. Judge Harrison, watching through his field glasses, wrote a quick note to Hawk. "Duncan's not just fighting. He's conducting an operation I saw once in the war, systematic isolation of the command element, cutting off the snake's head." Marcus, recognizing his position was compromised, made a final desperate gambit. "Burn it," he ordered through his signal whistle. "Burn everything." But the men he'd positioned with the oil barrels and Greek fire never got the chance to carry out his orders. Duncan had anticipated this move. Hawk's Cherokee tracking skills had located every cache of incendiary weapons, and Swift Hand McGrath had spent the battle quietly neutralizing the men guarding them. The final piece of Duncan's strategy was revealed. He hadn't just been fighting Keller's men, he'd been systematically dismantling their capacity for destruction. Through the rain and chaos, Marcus caught glimpses of his defeat unfolding like a perfectly orchestrated play. His remaining men were being herded into killing zones or forced to surrender. The carefully planned offensive had been turned against him, transformed into a trap by a man who had made silence his greatest weapon. In a lightning flash, Marcus saw Duncan approaching through the storm, moving with the terrible purpose of an avenging angel. The legendary Colt revolver held low and ready, each step measured and precise. Behind him, the silhouettes of his allies emerged from the darkness. McGrath, Hawk, and Judge Harrison, each covering a different angle of escape, the moment Marcus Keller had feared since learning Dead-Eye Duncan's true identity had finally arrived. The master strategist found himself caught in a trap of his own making, faced with an opponent who had turned every carefully laid plan into a pathway to this final confrontation. The rain continued to fall, and in its curtain, two legends prepared to settle a debt that had been building since the ashes of Willow Creek. The storm that had transformed Shadow Creek Valley into a battlefield began to ease, as if nature itself was stepping back to witness the final confrontation between two legends. Marcus Keller stood in a small clearing, the mud-churned ground, around him littered with spent cartridges and broken dreams of victory. Before him, Dead-Eye Duncan advanced with the inexorable purpose of fate itself. If you're holding your breath for this moment of truth, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's episode reveals another legendary showdown that shaped the West forever. "You've gotten sophisticated since Willow Creek," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man who had accepted his position but hadn't surrendered to it. "All this elaborate planning, the psychological warfare, almost makes me proud. Seems I taught you something after all." Duncan couldn't hear the words, but he could read the meaning in Marcus's stance, in the way his hand hovered near his gun. Behind Marcus, Swift Hand McGrath and Hawk moved to cut off any escape, while Judge Harrison maintained his elevated position, covering the approaches with his rifle. Through the diminishing rain, Samuel Keller stumbled into the clearing, his wounded hand cradled against his chest. Jack Turner, following close behind, tried to stop him, but was too late. "Brother," Samuel called out, "he's got us surrounded. We need to—" Marcus's shot took Samuel in the chest without hesitation or warning. The younger Keller fell backward, his expression one of shocked betrayal, as he realized what deep down he'd always known. To Marcus, he'd never been anything but a tool to be used and discarded. "You were always a liability, Samuel," Marcus said coldly, "just like Jacob was, just like everyone who let their emotions cloud their judgment." He turned back to Duncan, his smile razor-sharp. "That's the difference between us and them. We understand that sentiment is weakness." Duncan's response came not in words, but in action. His Colt seemed to materialize in his hand, its barrel catching the first rays of moonlight breaking through. The storm clouds. The shot was precise, surgical, not targeting Marcus, but rather the hidden derringer he'd been preparing to draw with his left hand. The small backup gun went spinning into the mud, along with two of Marcus's fingers. The former colonel's face contorted with pain and rage, but his main revolver was already clearing leather. "You think you've won?" he snarled. "You think this elaborate trap changes anything? I built my legend on battlefields while you were still learning to cope with the silence." Their final duel unfolded in a series of frozen moments, illuminated by the last flickers of lightning. Marcus was fast, his military training evident in every movement, but Duncan had spent a lifetime learning to read the subtlest signals of impending violence. He saw the tension build in Marcus's shoulder, noted the shift of weight that preceded his draw. Time seemed to slow as both men fired. Marcus's bullet cut through the space where Duncan had been a heartbeat before, while Duncan's shot struck with devastating accuracy. The legendary gunslinger hadn't aimed to kill. Instead, his bullet shattered Marcus's gun hand, sending his revolver spinning away into the darkness. As Marcus fell to his knees, clutching his ruined hand, Duncan approached with deliberate steps. Doc Sarah Wheeler, arriving at the scene, would later write in her journal, "I've seen many gunfights, but never one like this. It wasn't just skill with a weapon, it was the culmination of two different philosophies of power. Marcus's need to dominate through fear, meeting Duncan's patience, his ability to turn silence into strength." Sheriff Hayes and his deputies moved in to secure Marcus, but Duncan had one final message to deliver. He drew out his slate and wrote words that would be remembered long after the gun smoke cleared. "You burned Willow Creek to teach people fear. I spared you to teach them justice." The moon broke fully through the clouds, casting silver light over a transformed Shadow Creek Valley. Marcus Keller's reign of terror had ended not with the bang of gunfire, but with the quiet authority of a man who had mastered his own silence. Yet even as deputies led the former colonel away, tensions lingered in the air. The night held one final act of violence that none of them saw coming, an echo of the past that refused to rest. The storm that had transformed Shadow Creek Valley into a battlefield began to ease, as if nature itself was stepping back to witness the final confrontation between two legends. Marcus Keller stood in a small clearing, the mud-churned ground, around him littered with spent cartridges and broken dreams of victory. Before him, Dead-Eye Duncan advanced with the inexorable purpose of fate itself. If you're holding your breath for this moment of truth, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's episode reveals another legendary showdown that shaped the West forever. "You've gotten sophisticated since Willow Creek," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man who had accepted his position but hadn't surrendered to it. "All this elaborate planning, the psychological warfare, almost makes me proud. Seems I taught you something after all." Duncan couldn't hear the words, but he could read the meaning in Marcus's stance, in the way his hand hovered near his gun. Behind Marcus, Swift-Hand McGrath and Hawk moved to cut off any escape, while Judge Harrison maintained his elevated position, covering the approaches with his rifle. Through the diminishing rain, Samuel Keller stumbled into the clearing, his wounded hand cradled against his chest. Jack Turner, following close behind, tried to stop him, but was too late. "Brother," Samuel called out, "he's got us surrounded. We need to—" Marcus's shot took Samuel in the chest without hesitation or warning. The younger Keller fell backward, his expression one of shocked betrayal, as he realized what deep down he'd always known. To Marcus, he'd never been anything but a tool to be used and discarded. "You were always a liability, Samuel," Marcus said coldly. "Just like Jacob was. Just like everyone who let their emotions cloud their judgment." He turned back to Duncan, his smile razor-sharp. "That's the difference between us and them. We understand that sentiment is weakness." Duncan's response came not in words, but in action. His Colt seemed to materialize in his hand, its barrel catching the first rays of moonlight breaking through. The storm clouds. The shot was precise, surgical, not targeting Marcus, but rather the hidden derringer he'd been preparing to draw with his left hand. The small backup gun went spinning into the mud, along with two of Marcus's fingers. The former colonel's face contorted with pain and rage, but his main revolver was already clearing leather. "You think you've won," he snarled. "You think this elaborate trap changes anything? I built my legend on battlefields while you were still learning to cope with the silence." Their final duel unfolded in a series of frozen moments, illuminated by the last flickers of lightning. Marcus was fast, his military training evident in every movement. But Duncan had spent a lifetime learning to read the subtlest signals of impending violence. He saw the tension build in Marcus's shoulder, noted the shift of weight that preceded his draw. Time seemed to slow as both men fired. Marcus's bullet cut through the space where Duncan had been a heartbeat before, while Duncan's shot struck with devastating accuracy. The legendary gunslinger hadn't aimed to kill. Instead, his bullet shattered Marcus's gun hand, sending his revolver spinning away into the darkness. As Marcus fell to his knees, clutching his ruined hand, Duncan approached with deliberate steps. Doc Sarah Wheeler, arriving at the scene, would later write in her journal, "I've seen many gunfights, but never one like this." It wasn't just skill with a weapon. It was the culmination of two different philosophies of power. Marcus's need to dominate through fear, meeting Duncan's patience, his ability to turn silence into strength. Sheriff Hayes and his deputies moved in to secure Marcus, but Duncan had one final message to deliver. He drew out his slate and wrote words that would be remembered long after the gun smoke cleared. "You burned Willow Creek to teach people fear. I spared you to teach them justice." The moon broke fully through the clouds, casting silver light over a transformed Shadow Creek Valley. Marcus Keller's reign of terror had ended not with the bang of gunfire, but with the quiet authority of a man who had mastered his own silence. Yet even as deputies led the former colonel away, tensions lingered in the air. The night held one final act of violence that none of them saw coming, an echo of the past that refused to rest.